Hey everyone, I'm Stan Nurilov, and I have this week's internet weather. So we'll start with our usual top 10 most probe ports. This is us just really trying to study the activity that happens on the internet related to scanning and the top ports that usually get scanned on the internet. It could be one IP address that's engaged in this or a lot of IP addresses, but the measure here is how many probes or records related to a specific port there are. The two ports I decided to examine this week are port 2375 TCP and 2376 TCP. Now, we've actually covered these ports exactly a month ago, but back then they had come out of the bottom, like somewhere, I think they were like ranked 20 or something like that. But now they seem to be like a staple in the top 10 and seeming to always be there. Generally, this indicates some sort of interest or potential vulnerability that exists on a port, and we just like to keep our eye on it and understand who's behind this kind of scanning and potentially what they might be trying to accomplish.
So, Stan, before you move on, I noticed at number 5 there, you've got port 389 UDP. That's LDAP, and it's jumped up into the top 10. Maybe we should take a closer look at that one.
You're right, Jim. Maybe we should. Looking at that port, 389 UDP, it looks like over the last year, the activity, it was kind of stable, but has recently, in the past few weeks, been increasing. Actually, it seems like maybe it's even in the last 2 months or so, if you kind of just let your eye follow a trend here. I think you were mentioning, Jim, that LDAP is a protocol that lots of adversaries are interested in, and probably for many good reasons. That's the protocol where authentication happens, right? This is where you're getting your directory information, potentially. What are the properties of a particular user? So it's definitely of interest to probably a variety of people.
I think it's one that we should probably keep an eye on over the coming weeks, because it is starting to go up, but we don't really have a good idea of what it is they're looking for yet.
Yeah, I think you and I kind of looked at the number of IP addresses engaged in the scanning. And even in the last 90 days, it didn't seem like the number of IP addresses has increased. So that's interesting. That means that the IP addresses that are doing it are doing a lot more of it than before. So it is peculiar what the interest is about and why suddenly it's increased. There could be a vulnerability or a new tactic that someone's figured out. So like you said, Jim, I think we'll have to keep a closer look on the LDAP scanning.
And the other way we'll look at scanning activity or reconnaissance activity on the internet is by the number of devices that are scanning a specific port all at once. So this is our most sources probing report. And this week, we don't see major changes. There's some change from maybe the top, from second place to third place and vice versa, but it's all the same IP addresses as we've always seen. So I decided to focus in on port 8728 TCP and 8291 TCP. These are important ports because they're associated with MikroTik devices. Probably a few months ago, or maybe even a year ago, we kind of saw them for the first time, and it was really interesting to see what's going, that they rose so quickly, seemingly out of nowhere. But they've been reliably in the top 10 ports list for many weeks now. And many months now. So I just wanted to see what the activity looks like now, if there's any major changes. Now, this particular 2 ports are important to pay attention to, because unlike others that are like associated with well-known protocols or, well-known web services, these specifically have to do with routers or specific brand of routers for microtik devices. And we have some insight that a lot of adversaries actually like to use microtik, compromised microtik routers as part of their C2 infrastructure. So it seems to me that, they're kind of always on the lookout for this easy to exploit device. So if you are running a microtik device out there, you just ensure that these ports aren't exposed to the internet because you could become victimized. So let's focus in on port 2375 TCP and port 2376 TCP. Again, we've covered this last week, and I think back then we only looked at the last 30 days of activity. So this time around, I decided to take a look at 1 year's worth of activity on this port and seeing what scanning looks like. And you could see that the scan volume is not high. It's, 50 to 100 million flows per hour related to these two ports a year ago. But gradually, especially over the last month or so, maybe even two, you could see the activity has been increasing. So there's been a lot more scanning associated with these ports. And it usually indicates a lot more interest. So usually to offset that, I like to see who is doing the scanning. Are there more IP addresses doing the scanning? How many are there doing it per hour? So this is a chart that reflects after the past year. And you could see, while there have been, spikes here or there, overall it's been pretty steady, with a few dozen or maybe a few hundred IP addresses engaged in this activity. But we kind of start seeing maybe in April, like this gradual increase in the number of IP addresses engaged in this activity. Now it seems like, between the two of them, there's like 1,000 or and a half IP addresses doing it concerted at the same time. So generally this represents either a couple of adversaries sharing information and kind of, looking for this activity altogether, or possibly the beginning of like a worm or a wormable exploit where people are basically using the same, an infection to keep propagating the infection.
So moving on, this chart here represents where the IP addresses are located geographically. I always like to map it geographically because it helps me to understand where maybe the problem is originating from, or sometimes it helps you to understand like maybe who's engaged in the activity. So you could see the activity is obviously worldwide, but there is a much higher concentration of scanning emanating out of IP addresses in Asia. So it's definitely quite an interesting visual to see. But what is this? So we've covered this before, actually. These ports are both related to the Docker Rust API. And it's 2016, there was a vulnerability released with the Cisco Cloud Center Orchestrator, which basically allows someone to eventually inject their own Docker image into something. So what can you do with your own Docker image? I'll leave that up to the imagination of our viewers. Certainly the adversaries don't need to use their imagination because they have already. But anything really from, hosting C2, being a forwarder, being a proxy, or cryptocurrency mining. So this is a very old vulnerability. And it's possible that the adversaries have discovered something new about it, which has, allowed them to start looking again. Just from our honeypot, we could see the types of packets that are sent, or the types of messages that are sent to maybe look for this activity. But at least it kind of explains the service. So if you have a Docker engine running out there somewhere, or some sort of cloud orchestration platform on these ports, if Cisco Cloud Center Orchestrator sounds familiar, you may want to just make sure that these ports are not exposed on the internet, and that certainly you've patched for anything that existed in 2016. Because if you don't, you could become the victim of this type of activity, and somebody may abuse your service to launch their own Docker images. Okay, moving on. So the next part here is the activity that we wanted to revisit for port 8728 TCP and port 8291 TCP. What I'd like to point out about this activity is in the last 90 days, it's actually pretty steady. So this is consistent with this port just always being in the top 10. The activity is not increasing or decreasing. Yes, is there kind of like, on different days, are some hours more active than others? Yes, they are. And actually, even that alone is kind of unusual, because usually scanning activity is pretty stable. A device that's infected is scanning all of the time. And for the activity to fluctuate like this actually reminds me more of the pattern of users visiting or using a computing resource. So, there's more people, for example, using the computer in the middle of the day than there are in the middle of the night or even on the weekends. So you could see those peaks and valleys kind of reflect this. Some of the scanning happens when computers are turned on or more people are on, and some scanning happens when it's in the middle of the night. And because of this pattern here, this kind of up and down, I would say that the devices engaged in this, or at least a fair number of the devices engaged in this, most likely are some kind of devices that people use versus IP addresses in, like, say, or devices in like a hosting location. So it's probably, they get turned off and then they get turned back on again, the scanning resumes. So that's a pretty interesting observation just by itself. Moving on and just looking at the number of IP addresses engaged in the scanning, you could see something interesting here, which is it's the same. The only interesting thing about this chart is it's exactly the same as the previous. There's no major movements, but it does, again, it has this peaks and valleys where devices, again, come on or come off. You could see, I guess, a really good thing for humanity is there's a lot less usage of the internet on the weekends. So maybe we are taking a break from our computing devices. Taking this data and mapping it out geographically, I think just highlights something quite interesting. And I don't know if you guys could see it, but it's pretty much the whole world is lit up. There's devices on every continent, and I think pretty much every country that are engaged in scanning for these microtik ports. Although it does look like Asia, especially in China, there is not as much scanning as, let's say, there was for the Docker ports. So that itself is actually a very interesting observation. So while a lot of the world is scanning for this vulnerability, specifically China is not. And that might, tell us more if we zoom in on it further and study it further. So with that, I guess I've concluded the Internet Weather Report for this week. Hopefully you enjoyed hearing a little bit about the scanning on the ports related to Docker and the ports related to these microtik devices. If you have any more insight on these ports or any others that you've seen, or if there's a port that you're particularly interested in, feel free to reach out and leave a comment below, and we'll see if we can investigate that on a future episode of ThreatTraq. Thank you.